were the two teachers?
Where school is always in session.
Andy, we've done the three branches. We've done the Congress, we've done the presidency, we've done the courts. We have one more. Wait, I thought we had three branches, but today we're going to talk about the federal bureaucracy? I can't even spell it, let alone understand it.
I was wondering where you were going with this. When we talk about bureaucracy, Dan, we are talking about one of the branches of the government, of course. We're talking about the executive branch and the power to implement the laws. We know that when we say the president is the chief executive and has the power to implement laws, we know that the president isn't collecting taxes himself, that the president delegates those authorities to different departments in the federal bureaucracy, to different agencies that have the power to implement those laws that Congress wrote. But of course, we know that the president has enormous power to shape the bureaucracy's ability to implement those laws.
So you're saying when the president gives his daily press conference, the men and women standing behind them are the bureaucrats. Those are the ones who actually are helping to do what the president is saying. Or when you or grandma gets their stimulus check here this week, it's the bureaucracy that's actually printed the checks, signed them, mailed them, delivered them. This is the arm, leg of the U.S. government.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, that's the visual, that when we see those press conferences, it's almost always members of some department or agency, it's Centers for Disease Control, that are speaking about the federal government's response to coronavirus and the different policies. We see the whole range of the federal government in action, trying to shape policies or to implement new policies that Congress writes in order to respond. So yeah, you're seeing a lot of those faces of the bureaucracy and hearing about their job of implementing the laws.
Well, this is where it gets confusing to me, because let's just take, for instance, the stimulus checks. So Congress writes a law, the president said we need this, but now it's up to some bureaucrat to actually write the policies of how those checks will be printed. Then they have to enforce the actual sending out of those checks. And in some cases, they've actually built in some sort of rule where banks cannot even give those checks out because people might have back payments due. It sounds to me like bureaucrats are functioning as the entire three branches of government in one. With the discretionary authority that bureaucrats have, it's three branches in one.
We certainly know that when Congress writes big legislation, and $2 trillion is big legislation, it can't possibly put every detail into that law, and it gives the bureaucratic agencies and departments discretion on implementing that law. So a case in point, President Trump has his signature on a great number of these checks. There was nothing in the law that said that President Trump has to sign each of these checks or have his signature on each of these checks. That's part of what we call bureaucratic discretion to make that type of decision made at the executive branch level, not necessarily by the Congress.
So, Andy, how do we hold these bureaucrats in check then? How do we make sure they're doing what they're intended to do?
Well, again, that's Congress's job. Congress creates the bureaucracy. All those cabinet departments and agencies, they are there because Congress puts them there. They create laws, creating the different cabinet departments. What jurisdiction each of those departments is going to have is congressional authority. And then, of course, every year, that budget authority of Congress to determine how much money these different agencies are going to have to spend, how they're allowed to spend it. That budget authority is tremendous checks over the power of the executive branch.
Well, we also know, Andy, the president has some ability to check the president by just the agenda that he sets. His patronage appointments, we know in a bureaucracy of millions of workers, tens of thousands at least are direct appointments by the president, which can change the direction of the Department of Education or change the direction of Veterans Affairs. And of course, that judicial review is also a check on the bureaucracy. Andy, patronage versus civil service. Some of these bureaucrats, my postman's delivered my mail for over 25 years. Is this how bureaucrats work?
Well, the civil service is that idea that there's a large portion of our bureaucracy that are permanent employees, that they don't change, they don't lose their job because a Democrat gets elected president or a Republican gets elected president. That's what we call the civil service. We know particularly for the top levels of our bureaucracy, that another check that Congress has is that the Senate has to approve the president's nominees. And we also know that for many of those top levels of the bureaucracy, at some point, they have to report to Congress in how they're doing their job. And that's what we call testifying before Congress. That's another example of what we call congressional oversight of the bureaucracy and how the executive branch implements those laws.
Andy, trying to get our arms around the bureaucracy is very difficult. My encouragement to the students would be to find one agency and learn about it and then apply the rulemaking and enforcement and judicial actions by that bureaucracy. Take the TSA, for instance, something we probably all have experienced. How does the TSA determine the rules of how they check us as we come through the airports? How do they enforce that? How do they maybe dole out fines or punishments? Andy, the bureaucracy is not easy to understand, but it certainly is important because it is the arms, legs, and feet of our federal government. We're the two teachers.
And you're trying to get out of this without talking about iron triangles, Dan? I mean, come on. What are you doing to me?
I was trying to get out of this without talking about issue networks.
Okay, because we know that a student who's watching this is going to be, wait a minute, you can't talk bureaucracy without talking iron triangles.
You don't have a mushroom can, do you?
I don't.
Oh, thank God.
But we know that when Congress is writing those laws, oftentimes they're getting input from both the bureaucrats who are going to implement the laws and also special interest groups. Those are the three actors involved in most policymaking. Lawmakers from Congress, executives who implement the laws, and special interest groups. When you have really controversial legislation that you have a lot of different special interest groups having a voice on what the laws should be passed, that's what we call issue networks. And that can take a very long time, like immigration reform, healthcare reform. Those are parts of issue networks that we have a lot of voices, pluralism, where we fight about those policies, and it takes a long time. Iron triangles tends to be policies that are nitty-gritty, detailed, that we really, most people don't care about, like food regulations, like all the specific food regulations, where you have very few voices shaping those laws, the implementation of those laws. And that's what we call an iron triangle. It's still a lawmaker, an executive bureaucrat, and a special interest group in an iron triangle. It's just not as many voices, and it tends to be much quicker policy making.
Well, as we've been
Thank you, Dan.
As we've been sheltering, we've watched a lot about tigers. We've talked a lot about tigers. Well, apparently the tigers in our government are the bureaucrats who do a lot of our working for the federal government. And it would seem to me, as the American people, we need to keep an eye on them too. We're the two teachers. No fancy words.
No fancy suits.
Plain talk about issues you need to know.
Just in time.